Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third St. Joseph's Hospice webinar by the Supportive Services team. Our topic today is staying connected during COVID-19 as supporting children and youth. My name is Lisa Adams, and I'm the Living Life Well Program Coordinator at St. Joseph's Hospice, and I'll be joined by Orly Culverhouse in a few minutes. Please note that everyone is muted and not on camera. And feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions during our hour together, and we will be answering your questions at the end of our webinar today. The webinar is being recorded like our other ones and can be found on our hospice YouTube site. And we will be sending out the slides and any handouts from today at the end of, next week, we'll be sending those out. I would just like to add a little warning that before we begin, some of the topics that will be covered today may be a little sensitive for some and triggering for some people. And please know that you may connect with us at any time after our webinar if you wish. And at this time, I will hand it over to Orly, who happens to be wearing a very similar shirt as me today. Welcome, Orly.
Matching, yeah. So even when you're not connected in the workplace, you still, wear the same outfits as your coworkers to webinars. So thanks so much, Lisa. So yeah, my name is Orly Culverhouse, and I'm the Caring Hearts Children's Program Coordinator at St. Joseph's Hospice. My work primarily consists of working with children and youth and their families who are either facing the life-limiting illness of a loved one or they have experienced the death of a loved one. So we're going to be talking more about the illness side of things when children have loved ones with life-limiting illness. I think it's also important to note, just because I am noticing on the participant list, we have a little bit of a mixed group. There's some professionals in the audience, but we probably also have volunteers and maybe people who are in that situation of having a child when there's a loved one who has a life-limiting illness. So we'll try to make our presentation and information kind of applicable to everybody, but if you have further questions, hopefully we'll have time at the end, and then also you can always connect with us after if you have any questions. So I love this picture. This was actually taken from an article by the BBC, which is in the UK. And this was from kind of earlier, I think, in kind of COVID pandemic world. And you can see two grandparents, and on the one side of the glass, they're giving little kisses to their grandchild, which is just so sweet. And we will get us moving to the next. Perfect. So this is kind of what we're going to cover today. I always like to start off with a little bit of Grief 101. So if you've been to any of our other webinars, this might be a little bit of repeat information for you, but we like to just start off with some general information about grief so we have a common understanding before we move forward. And then we'll talk a little bit about children's grief and explaining illness to children and youth, how grief might show up in children and youth and how it's different than adults. We'll talk about something called the 5 C's, and it's a really useful tool. And if there's nothing else that you remember from today, remember the 5 C's. And then we'll move more into some suggested activities for how to stay connected during COVID-19, and maybe even how you can approach grief and COVID-19, especially if you have little ones at home. And we'll talk about some resources. So just a few definitions to get us started. So we have grief, mourning, bereavement, and anticipatory grief. So today we'll focus more on anticipatory grief, but I think it's just important to know that anticipatory grief, or grief that we experience prior to the death of a loved one, is still grief. So when we're talking about grieving children and youth, that may be after they've experienced a death, but it can also be when they know that a loved one is dying or going to die. And so we can really use those definitions or keep those reactions or responses, grief responses in mind for both before and after a loss happens, if that makes sense. But the big thing we want to talk about, so grief is that constellation of internal experiences that we have. We might think of grief as the container holding all of those thoughts, reactions, feelings, experiences. And then the difference between grief and mourning. Mourning would be when we take our grief and externalize it or express it somehow. So there's lots of different ways that we might experience or engage in mourning. It's very unique to the individual. Culture plays a big role. Religion and spirituality can play a big role. But mourning might be crying, if you engage in any rituals, praying, talking about the person who died, talking to the person who died, all are examples of mourning. And then bereavement refers to the period of mourning and grief following the death of a loved one. So grief is not death specific, but bereavement is. So we experience grief after all different kinds of losses. We might think of a loss through divorce. If we've lost a job, moving can be, we experience grief. And so no one has died, but it's still grief. Whereas when we're talking about bereaved children or bereaved individuals, it means, bereavement essentially means a death has occurred. So I won't spend too much time here. Some of the different effects of grief. I think one of the big myths that we have out there is that grief is just a feeling, and that's absolutely not true. Grief is this immersive experience that involves much more than just our emotions. And so we just have some examples of different ways that grief might show up. We absolutely grieve physically when we think of physical feelings like fatigue, changes in our appetite. When we we might have, we would call them somatic experiences, which is really common in children and youth, which would be, headaches, stomach aches, that kind of thing. Grief is absolutely something that we experience physically. We experience grief cognitively or intellectually. Lots of people, I was just chatting with someone yesterday who said, I'm forgetting things, I'm putting the remote control in the refrigerator, I'm putting dirty dishes away in the cupboards, and I'm not myself. It's like my brain is just like off. And so we would call that grief fog. That's one of the more cognitive or intellectual experiences of grief that people have. We grieve spiritually when we think about our awareness of mortality, or maybe the way that we make meaning out of our experiences. And then absolutely we grieve socially, right? The social roles that we take up, that thinking of, a loss of identity of who am I now without my person. I think in most relationships, you kind of settle into whether it's a romantic relationship or a parent-child relationship or more of a friend relationship. Usually we all have social roles within our relationships. And so if you're a person who died always took up a certain social role and they die and they're not there to take up that role, or if they experience a life-limiting illness and they're not able to inhabit that role in the same way, there's grief there, right? And trying to navigate, maybe you having to fill that role or someone else having to fill that role, and that kind of uncomfortable feeling of trying to move on socially, if that makes sense. So let's talk about children and children's grief and how children are different than adults. So when we think about kids, children have immature cognitive development, which interferes with their ability to understand the irreversibility, the universality, and inevitability of death. So whenever we're thinking about grieving children and youth, we always have to think about what stage they are at their development, because their development will have a huge impact on how they understand what death is, but definitely how they experience their grief. So if we think of a child who experiences either the illness or the death of a person at age 5, that's going to be much different than their experience at age 10, at age 15, and so on. And so we really have to think about where they're at developmentally. And then another key characteristic of children's grief, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is that as the child gets older, they'll hit that next developmental stage. And they may, because their brain is more developed, they may understand the death or the illness in new terms. And then what we find is it's almost like the wound is reopened again, and the child does what we would call re-grieving. And so I get lots of panicked calls from parents saying, so-and-so was doing really well, and I don't know what happened. And now it's like we've taken a few steps back and we're not really sure what's going on. It's been years. And so that's usually kind of textbook child re-grieving. They just understand the death in new terms. And so they're re-experiencing their loss, and that's absolutely normal. And if we think of, even for us as adults, we re-grieve throughout the lifespan too. If you think about, any of those major landmarks or social events like weddings and graduations, and we experience that, loss again. sometimes around major holidays, anniversaries, that kind of thing. Children have limited capacity to tolerate emotional pain. And so what we often find with kids is that there's kind of this big explosion of emotion or explosion just in general, and they're feeling it really intensely for a short period of time, and then they do something like, can I go play outside? And us as the adult is thinking, oh my gosh, like what just happened, kind of thing. But kids do a really, really good job of being able to regulate their experiences. And so they'll do something that we call puddle jumping, where they're in the experience, they experience it intensely, and then they're moving on to the next thing. And that's very normal for kids. So to move on to that, children may have, we would call acute feel. So acute means kind of big or extreme, or those acute feelings of loss that occur in spurts over many years. They have limited ability to verbalize their feelings, so it can be very difficult, I think, to sit down and have a conversation about feelings or about grief with a child, which is why at the hospice we use so much play and games, and because we know that play is how children process their world. And so the best way that we can get a good idea of what the child is experiencing and how they're processing is to play with them, which is why my job is pretty great. Kids are sensitive about being different from their peers. We especially see this, I would say, with like preteens. And grief, what we know about grief is that it's really isolating. And so children who, I might be, if I'm a child who is bereaved or has a person who's sick, I might be the only person in my class who's experiencing that. And so, and we don't want to be different from our peers, right? And so again, that's really important, why it's really important to set up kids to have experiences where they can meet other kids who around their age, who have had a similar experience, which is something that we've done traditionally at the hospice, peer support groups. And then children are able to express their feelings in play, which we kind of already talked about. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but how is children's grief different from adult grief? What I traditionally find in my work is that we as adults expect children to grieve in the same way that we do. And so we're looking for things like lots of being kind of in that dark ocean all the time, and mostly emotional responses, no other, responses or experiences of grief. And then when kids don't, their grief doesn't materialize in the same way that adult grief does, we kind of assume that the child is fine. And it just might mean that we're missing those grief expressions because kids experience grief very differently. So children's grief is intermittent, or it might happen in spurts. But then the child says things like, can I go play outside? And then they seem like they're completely fine. Whereas with adults, they're kind of in that all the time. The child's understanding is limited to their age and developmental stage, whereas with adults, obviously, when we experience a loss, our brain is fully developed. We understand immediately what the impacts of the death are, usually. With children, they grow up with the loss, so they develop with that loss and experience it differently as they hit each developmental stage. Whereas again, adults are fully developed and grown when the loss occurs. Children sometimes may need help remembering, whereas with adults, memories are more fully developed. And it's very common for kids to continue, especially when we see things like imaginative play and magical thinking. It's really common for kids to kind of almost create memories with their person, and very, very normal, and we need to be supportive of that as adults, whereas it's not so much, we wouldn't really see that as much with adults. Kids can speak very honestly and openly about death. So, I mean, in my work, I can almost always have a more frank and blunt conversation with a child about death and dying, about illness, than I can with an adult. Whereas adults, we see that we're usually more aware of or impacted by societal expectations surrounding death and dying. That's not really something that we talk about. We definitely live in a grief-phobic, death-phobic, dying-phobic, big emotion-phobic society. And so kids are just not as encumbered by that as adults are. Whereas, it's pretty common for a family to come in and the caregiver is telling me things like, my 6-year-old tells every single person that they see, whether it's the bus driver or the person at the grocery store checking us out, that daddy died. And it's just their way of processing. It's their way of kind of working through that loss. Whereas, you know, for adults, that can be kind of an uncomfortable experience if our kid is doing that, but it's very, very normal. And then obviously kids are dependent on caregivers to meet their needs, whereas adults can obviously usually meet their own needs. So we talked about this kind of this idea of puddle jumping. So we have a quote from Winston's Wish, which is an organization in the UK that works with grieving children and youth. And so it says, for adults, grief is like wading through this enormous river, whereas for children, it's puddle jumping. But when they're in the puddle, it's no different to the river. So this idea of thinking of grief as an adult, yeah, we're in this deep ocean or river, it's dark, we're in it all the time, it's all encompassing, and we can't really, we're always there. Whereas with kids, they jump into the puddle and it's like they're in that really deep, dark ocean or that river with us, and then they're on to doing the next thing. And so a really great thing to remember is that we would say that children grieve in chunks. And so that kind of jumping into the puddle and out of the puddle. And it's really important for us as adults, either, you know, as parents, as caregivers, as clinicians, as supportive people in children's lives, to let them jump in and out of their grief. It can be really challenging. I think we want to have those conversations and we want to support our kids. And so it's really tempting when the child says, you know, can I go play now? We want to say, you know, no, come back. Like, I want to keep talking about this, or I want to make sure that you understand. But what they're telling us when they jump out of that puddle is that they're saying, I've had enough. I'm not able to, I'm good for right now. And when I can tolerate more emotional pain, then I'll jump back into that puddle again. But it can be challenging, I think, for adults because you don't always know when they're going to jump into that puddle. And it's kind of like supporting them while they're in the puddle and then when they're out of the puddle and just being kids, because grieving children are still children in in every way. They still run and jump and laugh and play and do all those things that kids do. And so we just want to be supportive to them and meet them where they're at, whether it's being in the puddle or not so much in the puddle. It can also be challenging, I think, when our child is in that puddle or having that grief expression and it's really big and there's a lot going on, it can sometimes be uncomfortable to sit there and really bear witness and ride the wave out with the child. But I usually remind parents and caregivers that if you can just sit with that child, if you can just kind of take a deep breath and be with those big, when the child is in the puddle, usually after a certain amount of time, and it's not very long, they'll regulate and they'll move on to the next thing. But again, it can be scary. I mean, when a child is having a really big reaction. And so then we do things like we try to distract them, or we try to, fix it, and so usually if you can just wait and be with the child and be present with them, they will come out of that puddle on their own and they'll move on to the next thing. It's just easier said than done sometimes. So common grief reactions in children. So again, we talked about anticipatory grief, and that anticipatory grief is still grief. So whether the child has a loved one who has died or they have a loved one who is dying and has a life-limiting illness, we might see, it's all grief is what I want to say. And so we might see these kinds of reactions both before and after the loss has happened. The big thing I think we want to say about children, so I mean, they grieve in chunks. What we see very commonly are behaviors. It comes out in behaviors and in physical symptoms. So the child might not be having these really big emotional experiences like adults might, but they might say things like, my tummy hurts, or I don't feel good, or they want to come home from school, they have headaches. And then obviously, yeah, behaviors, right? So maybe getting in trouble at school, maybe, being a little bit more defiant, and that's so normal, and we would expect that from children. But a few others that we might see commonly would be, changes in sleep, maybe some regression even. So we might have the child who has been in the big kid bed for a really long time, is now wanting to co-sleep with caregivers, and that's totally fine. Irritability, hyperactivity, anger, that all kind of falls under that. It can be kind of that more behavior side of things. Death play is very common, especially in smaller children. And so, I've had kids come in and we have, at the hospice, we have lots of puppets and different toys, and we have a doctor's kit, and so kids will play through, okay, it's now, you know, we've done the operation, oh no, the operation didn't work, and now it's your time to die, and then we're playing funeral. And so if you're a parent in the next room listening to all of this going on, it might kind of be a little bit concerning, like hearing your child kind of playing through those scenarios. But again, when we think about how children process their world through play, it's very normal for them to then, if that's what's going on, if someone is sick and dying, then they're going to play that through. And it's important that we as adults support that and allow that to happen, because that's how they're going to make sense of what's going on. Repetitive asking of questions. I get lots of questions about this, or lots of concern from caregivers saying, you know, so-and-so keeps asking me the same question over and over again. And I think the tendency is for the parent to think that it's because the answer that I've given is not good enough, or they're not understanding, and so maybe I need to change my answer. But I find that a lot of times kids will ask the same questions to hear the same answers. It can be kind of anxiety relieving to know that this is the answer to the question. So no, remember, so-and-so has cancer, and they're at the hospital right now. And we might not be able to see them because they're not feeling well. And cancer is we'll talk about how to explain cancer to kids. But it's that the reason that they ask that question over and over again is to hear the same answer. And it can be stabilizing and structuring for kids to hear that the answer doesn't change no matter how many times they ask. Increased need for affection might be. We talked about regression. Guilt, and we'll talk a little bit more about guilt when we talk about the 5 C's. Maybe being a little bit more clingy, having difficulty in school, so maybe with attention, like paying attention in school, or maybe getting into trouble a little bit at school. And then when we think with youth, many of the same grief expressions. When I'm thinking about teens, we hear a lot about problems in school, like having trouble paying attention, maybe my marks are going down, feeling maybe more overwhelmed by things like tests or assignments, that kind of thing. And so I often encourage caregivers to work with the school and see if they can tailor workload a little bit. Something else that I'm always keeping an eye on with teens is an increase in, and this doesn't happen with everybody, but it can be potentially increased in or an increase in risk-taking behavior. But with teens, we see more, they're coming of age, they're getting to this point in their life where they're gaining independence and finding out who they are, and then something happens, like a loved one becomes sick or dies, that makes them feel so dependent on the people around them. And so it's really this hard balance to be able to find when you're a teenager. We often see that teenagers need to be with their peers a lot more, and so that can be challenging if you're a parent because you really want to know what's going on with your teen, but trying to support that as much as possible. We might see things like anger. We still might see those behaviors or being dysregulated. Changes in academic performance we talked about. I think teens also, because they're a little bit more developed than children are, they think more long-term, right? They think about who's going to watch me graduate, who's going to see me walk down the aisle, those kinds of things, whereas we don't always see that with kids. And then, yes, we talked about that internal conflict between desiring independence and then also being very dependent or feeling dependent. Because when somebody we love is sick or has died, it makes the world feel very unsafe. So how do we talk to if we know that there's a loved one who has a life-limiting illness, how do we talk to children and teens about the illness? So it's really important to name and describe the illness and its origin. So as much as possible, not just to say, Nana is sick or so-and-so is sick. If the person has a disease like cancer or ALS, we want to use that name. The reason is, when children, especially smaller children, we think of when we get a cold or when we get the flu, we'll say, so-and-so is sick. And if we just say the word sick over and over again, and then someone eventually dies, then the next time, mom or dad gets the flu and is on the couch, the child is going to think the last person who was sick died. And so we really want to think about how cancer is not the same as having the flu. And so it's really important to use the name of the disease when you're talking with children. And this just comes down to we encourage caregivers and parents and adults as much as possible to be honest with children. What we know about kids is that they can very much deal with the known. It's the unknown where we run into problems. And so we really, I would encourage you, if you have a child and there's a loved one who's sick, to resist the temptation to kind of bypass those conversations and to really be honest with the kids. For some, if you're thinking about having this conversation to tell a child that a loved one has cancer, for example, we would start with talking about how they have cancer. The way that I usually explain cancer to children is I talk about cells. So most kids, I don't know what grade they start talking about cells in school, but most kids have an understanding of what cells are. Like they might talk about blood cells in school. On Netflix, they have episodes of The Magic School Bus, which is a show that was on when I was a kid and I loved. And one of the episodes, they go inside one of the children's bodies and the bus shrinks down and it rides around on a red blood cell. So if you're thinking about wanting to have that inside the body cell conversation, that's a great resource to use. And kids like it. I mean, it's a cartoon, right? And so when cancer happens, so we talk about how inside of our bodies, there's billions and billions and billions of cells, and they actually what make up our body. And we have things like skin cells, and we have hair cells, we have blood cells. You might say things, we have nose booger cells, we have organ cells. There's all different kinds of cells that help make up our body. And when cancer happens, there's a cell somewhere in the child's or in the person's body that's not doing its job. And so, I mean, it depends on how in depth you want to get with your child, because we talk about how cells are constantly dividing and dying. It's really, really normal for cells to have a lifespan and that they die. But if they're smaller kids, I might just say, there's a cell somewhere in the body that's not doing its job, and it starts to grow really, really fast. And eventually it becomes something that we would call a tumor. So you can see the little picture that I've used on our slide. And I actually have several pictures that are similar to that. And we have them at the hospice laminated, and I'll show kids, like, this is what it looks like when that cell is not doing its job and it's getting bigger and bigger. And then you might say, depending on where that tumor is in the person's body, that's how we know what kind of cancer they have. So we know that the tumor, the cell that wasn't doing its job, and the tumor that's, started growing in the person's body started in their liver. And so we know that that means that they have liver cancer. I have other pictures where there are pieces of the tumor that break off and travel in the bloodstream. So if we talk about maybe cancer spreading, I might use that kind of picture. And so that would be how I explain cancer. So it's something that starts in a person's cells in their body. For some kids, so I mean, that's a huge mouthful of an explanation, and that's lots. So for some kids, that might be like, okay, that's enough for me, and I'm going to go off and do the next thing. So these conversations might take place over several conversations, and it's really important that we meet the child where they're at and not give them more information than what they're asking, and only answer the questions that they're asking, if that makes sense. And so then some kids, I find like older like preteens and teens are interested in wanting to know what kind of treatment the person is going through or what treatments have been tried. So we might talk about how, there's chemotherapy and there's radiation, and the goal of those treatments is to make the cancer smaller or to kill those bad cells. And so it depends on what kind of treatment the person is receiving. So, chemotherapy, you can receive it through an IV, which is, we all know what an IV is, but that's where there's medicine that's put directly into the person's blood, or in through a vein and through an IV. Sometimes people take chemotherapy orally, or like taking a pill. Radiation, I have different these different laminated things that talk about radiation, and so it just depends on, there's lots of different ways. Sometimes the person has to drive to London to have treatment. And so for some kids, this is important to know, and for other kids, not so much. So it's just about knowing your child and then also answering the questions that they ask. We might talk about signs or proof that the disease is getting worse. So, you know, it might be as a person's illness progresses, maybe they're not able to walk as much or they're a lot more tired. So we say, you know, we know that so-and-so's cancer is actually getting worse because they're so much more tired now. And remember, they used to be able to play outside with you for hours and hours, and now, you know, they need to take lots of breaks. And that's one of the reasons that we know that the cancer is spreading or is getting worse or progressing. You know, sometimes people might have some distressing symptoms, so we might want to talk with kids about that, depending on you know, the child and if they want to know about that and that kind of thing. But it's important to talk about the disease progressing, because we want to just prepare the child for what's going to happen. When we're talking, if we know that someone is palliative, is going to die, then we want to say that they're going to die. So we don't want to say things like, so-and-so, you know, isn't going to get better. There's nothing more that we can do, because not going to get better is not the same thing as going to die to a child. So if we say, you know, Nana's at the hospital and she's not going to get better, the child will think, okay, Nana's just going to live at the hospital now, and she's just always going to be in that hospital bed, and that's what she's going to be like forever, if we think, you know, from a child's perspective. Whereas it's very different than, you know, Nana is going to die. And then also when we say things like there's nothing more we can do, I mean, I think that all of the palliative care doctors that I know, there's lots of things that we can do when there's someone who has a life-limiting illness and they're dying, right? We provide medication to give comfort, to manage symptoms. So there's lots of things that we're actually doing. Nurses are making sure that they're cared for and that they're comfortable. And so we don't really, I feel like we want to talk about the things that we are doing. Try to avoid the word sorry. The reason that I say that is that what we teach children is that when you do something wrong or do something bad, you apologize, you say, I'm sorry. And so sometimes when we as adults, when a loved one has a life-limiting illness or they've died, we say, you know, I'm so sorry for your loss. And sometimes that makes kids think that you might have had something to do with it. And really, I mean, this can be mitigated with a quick conversation saying, you know, people are going to say that they're sorry a lot, and it doesn't mean that they did anything to make so-and-so sick. It just means that they feel really sad for you. And then reinforce that if someone is dying, that it is not due to the lack of effort. So we have a lot of, and I'm not in marketing or anything like that, but when we think of lots of campaigns about fighting cancer or beating cancer, or you know, you can read someone's obituary and it'll talk about after a long battle with cancer, you know, so-and-so like lost their fight or what have you. And so again, I'm not in marketing, so I don't know about, it's probably a really good strategy about like, we're going to beat cancer, that kind of thing. But to kids, when we use that kind of language, it might make them think that if my person had tried harder or fought harder, that they could have beat cancer. And so we just have to be really careful about that, like war rhetoric when it comes to cancer or illness in general, because we really want kids to know that if this person could choose to stay with you and to not have cancer, they would absolutely be choosing this. It's not that they aren't trying hard enough or that they're giving up. And so we really want to make sure that we touch on that with children and youth. Other things that we might talk about if someone is kind of heading in that direction of actively dying is that the body knows how to die. Everybody's body goes through a similar process when they're dying. Even though the person is dying, they still are a part of the family. It doesn't mean that you don't have a mother, father, aunt, uncle, grandpa, grandma anymore, that they still care about the child. That's another concern, I think, with that fight rhetoric, is that if they fought harder, or if they're not fighting harder, it means that they don't care about me. So it's just good things to touch on when we're talking to kids about illness. Cancer is what I probably primarily see with kids, and like we had that conversation, but I have talked about you know, end-stage dementia, ALS, but cancer is probably what we talk about the most frequently. And then sometimes people come in and they have a strange, you know, disorder that I haven't heard of, and I have to do some researching on my own time. so that I can have those conversations with kids. A lot of my support with children and youth who have a loved one with a life-limiting illness, I would say, is psychoeducational, which just means we spend a lot of time making sure that the child understands what the illness is, because once kids have that information, they tend to do far better than if they don't have that information. So we'll talk about the 5 C's. So we talk about this actually when someone is ill, but also after someone has died. And again, it's a great tool. If you remember nothing else from today, remember the 5 C's. And it's just interesting, when I first started in this work, there was 3 C's. And then I can't remember when the 4th one came along. And then the 5th one, we just recently heard about it. So 5 C's is kind of like a new, the 5th C is the newest one. But there's been a lot of research done about what do children commonly think of first when they find out that a loved one is dying or has died. So the first C is, did I cause it? And I often will have these 5 C's in the back of my head when I'm talking to kids, and kind of almost use them as like a checklist when we're talking about illness or dying. So the first one is, did I cause it? So kids, especially younger kids, one of the wonderful things about being a child is that you have magical thinking and imagination, which is wonderful. But unfortunately, it can make children believe that their internal thoughts and beliefs can have real world implications. So this idea of, I thought a mean thought about so-and-so, or I was really mad and I yelled at them and then they got cancer, and so it must be my fault. And so we want to make sure that we talk to kids about how nothing that you think or say can make a person's body get cancer or can make a person's body die. And because they will often go to that, it must be because I'm a bad kid that's why this is happening. The next C is, can I catch it? So I tell this story, it happened years ago. I got a call from, when I work in the hospice, under normal circumstances, I got a call from one of the nurses, and there was a family, and there was a grandparent who was actively dying, and mother of these 2 children was quite activated because she wanted her boys to have the opportunity to say goodbye to the grandparent who was actively dying, and the boys wouldn't enter the room. And so, I went down, I talked with mom, and I said, well, why, like, why don't they want to go into the room? She said, I don't know, they're just afraid. And so there were 2 boys, they were probably like 8 and 11. And and they both had their tablets. And so I went and sat with them, and I said, your mom says that you don't want to go in and see so-and-so. Like, what's going on there? And they're like, because we don't want to catch cancer. Kind of like, duh. And so that's a really, if we think about that, that's a really easy, not necessarily an easy fix, but that's an easy conversation to have. So I said, like, you know what, so-and-so in the bed could sneeze in your mouth, and I guarantee you're not going to get cancer. It's not like having the flu. It's not like getting a cold, because what we know is that you can't catch cancer. Cancer is something that starts in the cells. And so once they had that information, both boys went in, they said their goodbyes. And so I think that we, as adults, maybe will not overcomplicate things, but assume that issues are much more complex than they actually are. Because if that parent had, and I think there was probably so much going on, right? But if someone had that conversation about, like, what's your concern about going in the room? And the kid said, well, we don't want to catch cancer. I think most of us feel comfortable having that conversation about, you know what, I don't know a lot about cancer, but I know you can't catch it like a cold or the flu. I think also when we think about more of the bereavement side of things, children will have concerns that after a loved one dies, that someone else is going to die. And so our job as adults is not to give them false reassurance in the sense of, well, I'm never going to die, or so-and-so is never going to die, because that's not true. What I will talk with kids about is that, it's really, if they've had a parent die, for example, it is possible that you might have another parent die or another person in your life die, but it's really unlikely that would happen. And for the most part, kids are okay with that answer. Can I cure it is very similar to did I cause it? And that idea that, like, magical thinking makes us think that our behavior, our internal world will have real world effects. So we have to talk about kids that no matter how good you are, no matter what kind of marks you get in school. If you make the basketball team, we can't make someone not have cancer anymore. We can't make someone not be dead anymore by just being really good. And then who will care for me is the fourth C. So kids need, I think, consistent adults in their lives. When someone is sick or is dying or has died, it really we can appreciate this as adults. It turns the world upside down. It doesn't feel safe anymore. And for kids, they need that stable, predictable environment, routine maybe, and to feel a sense of safety. They need to know that they are going to be taken care of and that people are going to make sure that their needs are met. And so it might be just having a conversation saying, I know it's really scary that so-and-so is sick, but I'm still going to make sure that your needs are met, and you don't just have me, you have, all these other people in your life who are going to make sure that you're taken care of, and that your needs are going to be met. And so then our fifth C, which is our newest C, which kind of inspired actually this presentation and some of the resources that we're going to send you, is how will we stay connected, which speaks to continuing bonds, which speaks to, if a loved one has died, memorializing, continuing that relationship. But then also when a loved one is ill, how do we continue our relationship even though the circumstances might be different? So when a loved one is ill and maybe we're not able to visit them due to their illness, or when their physical body has changed. And so we can have those conversations with kids about how we can continue the relationship even though things are different now, if that makes sense. We like to talk about when we're talking about having conversations with kids about illness or dying, when we're talking about supporting children, these roadblocks to communication. And you can also view them as roadblocks to support. And I think if you've ever experienced grief as an adult, we probably have all experienced these as well. And it's just when we're well-intended, but maybe missing the mark in trying to support or communicate with a child. So these are kind of the pitfalls that we fall into when we're having these conversations. I think it's very common for these conversations to elicit big emotions or big feelings from children. And so these are things that we might do that bypass those big feelings. So the first one is called the Fixit Trap. And so if we're thinking about that in the context of adults, when someone is sharing something really hard or difficult, they're expressing a lot of emotions, that speaks to our discomfort with maybe seeing the person really in pain, suffering. And so it comes from this very human desire to not want our children or our friends or whoever to experience pain, and we just want to take it away. And so we do things that would try to fix it by saying, so some people will kind of say platitudes like, well, everything happens for a reason, so-and-so isn't suffering anymore, or be so grateful for all the time that you had with your person, as a way to take away their pain because we're uncomfortable with it. But it ends up, there's this huge disconnect, because really when we think about it, there's nothing that you can say to fix what is unfixable, right? And so then to try with platitudes or kind of positive vibes or sayings is to not really be able to bear witness or meet a person where they're at. So that's a Fixit Trap. Advising, giving solutions. So we think about, when we say things to kids like, what you need to do, like you just need to, or you might do it to adults too, right? You just need to get out and like exercise more. You just need to like have a night out with your friends and like just really, live it up. And like, that's what you need to kind of get over this thing, or to, or with, we think of like if there's a child who is crying and experiencing like a big emotion, like they've jumped into that puddle, we might say, it's okay, you don't need to cry. Like, let's think about all the good times that we had with so-and-so, or like, you're going to get to see them later today, or, and really it's just, we're uncomfortable with that big emotion. We're trying to bypass it somehow, instead of just sitting with it and letting the child be in that puddle, knowing that eventually they will come out of it on their own. Praising. So, obviously we need to praise our children. I'm not advocating that we don't do this, but praising, we want to just be very mindful of the behaviors that we're praising. And we don't want to necessarily praise in response to one of these big emotions or having these hard conversations. So like a lot of times brave people will tell us, like people will say things you're you're so brave and you're so strong and you're such an inspiration. And that can make people feel like they can't really share what's going on with them, because if they're supposed to be this brave, strong person, you know, can they share their grief in front of you, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, we just want to be conscious of that with kids, about how we praise them, and then reassuring. And again, I think it's absolutely important to reassure our children. We just need to be, again, conscious of not providing false reassurances. So, you know, everything will be okay, everything will be fine, is not really, is maybe not even accurate if there's a person who is dying. But we can reassure things like, you know what, I don't have all the information right now, but I promise you, when I do find out more information, I'm going to let you know. Or if I promise that whatever your questions are, I'm going to do my best to answer them. I won't be untruthful with you. And if I don't know an answer, then I'll tell you I don't know, or I'll try to go get the answer for you. So there's a difference between that false reassurance and the kind of reassuring we want to be doing. So let's get into some suggested activities. So a lot of these activities are on a resource that we created that kind of goes with this conversation, called How Will We Stay Connected? And so the activity, or the instructions for this activity rather, are all laid out on that resource, and it's retrieved from the Children and Youth Grief Network has this amazing handbook for volunteers. If you are a clinician working with children and youth, you can email the Children and Youth Grief Network, and they will email you a free PDF copy of this book. It has lots of different resources and activities in it that you can do with kids. And I believe if you want a physical copy, they'll send it to you for free. You just have to pay the shipping, which is like $5. So it's a great resource. And so I will let you see the instructions for the hug, but the idea is that the child traces their arms, and then they can wear this hug, and they might put messages in the hug. They might put memories if they want to draw. It's really whatever they want to, like whatever they choose to do. And then they can wear it like a hug. So maybe they wear it when they're thinking of their person that they either can't visit, or the person who's ill, or maybe they even send it to the person who's ill, and then it's like they can wear the hug from the child. And so there's lots of variations on this activity. It's a really, really great one. And you'll see more about something, you'll see more about that in the resource. Something that we'll do at the hospice is a memorial pillowcase. So we have lots of different pillowcases that are donated from various quilting groups in the Sarnia Lambton community. And so this is an example of what a finished one would look like. So you see the child has used, we use fabric markers. You can also use permanent markers, but they sometimes don't last as well over time. But the child might draw memories, they might write messages to their person. Again, really, they can be as creative as they want with this. And then when you're done, you can put a pillow in it. And again, the child might decide to put their memory pillowcase on their bed, and whenever they're thinking about their person, maybe they hug the pillowcase, or they sleep with it at night, or they can give it to their person who is sick, and then knowing that the ill person has that with them can be a way to stay connected. I don't know if anybody's heard of this book called The Invisible String. So this book is not death specific or illness specific, but it's a great book that talks about how we're all connected by this invisible string all the time, even when we're far away from each other. And so I feel like it's a great resource for right now, when we're not able to visit loved ones, whether they have an illness or not. And then one of my colleagues today sent me the picture that's on the left. There's actually this, and we'll send it to you, this invisible string activity kit. So we have a PDF of that, and it's a few pages long, and there's some different activities that kids can do to feel connected with their loved one. And then this picture is just, you know, you can also, if you wanted to give it as a gift to a child, you can put all of they have all of the craft supplies with the kit, so that you can give it as a kind of like an activity book thing. This is also a really great resource when a child, if there's a loved one who has a really serious illness or a life-limiting illness. So this is actually a activity book that kids can do. I probably would say, you know, probably for kids like under age 10, this is really, really helpful for, and it helps them process their emotions. I was trying to find pictures of what it looks like on the inside, but it's just an activity book that they can go through at their own pace, or you can go through with them to just talk about the illness that the loved one is facing. Just some other ideas that we had about how to stay connected right now. So I mean, sending pictures that are drawn, or maybe letter writing. If you think of that picture that we saw in the beginning with the giving kisses through the window, I've seen lots of pictures of people playing with like dry erase markers and playing things like tic-tac-toe through a glass door, or things like hangman, or different like drawing activities where each person, the person who's sick and the child on the other side of the window, or vice versa, would both have a dry erase marker, and they can write messages or play games through the window. Video chat is also really popular right now. My aunt, who lives in London, and my grandmother and my mom are both in Sarnia, and so every morning at 8 o'clock they have been doing morning coffee video chats on Facebook Messenger. And it's just, most of them, my grandmother's obviously retired, but my mom and aunt are both working from home, and so they are kind of meeting each other every morning for coffee, and they have coffee in their own homes, and they have a little visit. There's a really cool app called Marco Polo, which I hadn't heard of until this pandemic, and it's a video sharing app where you record messages and then send them to your family or whoever. And whenever they have the time, so if you don't have time to video chat with someone, you can create a video and send it, and then they can respond whenever they have time via video. And so it's kind of like a video messaging software. So that can be really helpful for families right now. And then we want to talk a little bit about supporting children during COVID-19. We don't have too much time to spend here. We did a few weeks ago, at the end of May, a webinar that was all on grief and COVID-19. And so if you're interested more to hear about that, the recording of that webinar is on our YouTube page. So we won't spend too much time here because Kayla did a great job of covering that really well. But just like talking about children during COVID-19, especially if they're grieving either the dying or the death of a loved one, it's really important that we validate and normalize their feelings. We might want to spend some time talking about the things that we're able to control and the things that we're not able to control. So we're not able to control this pandemic, right? I mean, we do things like washing our hands and social distancing to keep people safe, but we can't control that there was a virus that came here and is spreading, and that's not something that we have control over. We can't control that people canceled school. And so thinking about, but what are the things that we can control? And so that can kind of give kids an opportunity to think about those things, and then to give them a little bit more control over what is otherwise a very uncontrollable situation. If you're at home with kids, you might want to think about engaging in family self-care, and what does that look like? So it depends on, what you're able to do, if it's spending some time outside, if it's maybe doing those social distancing visits through the window with your person that you're not able to be with. Keeping routines, I mean, I think we've heard that a lot, that it's important to keep a routine during the pandemic. I think that it's important with kids to be honest about what you know and what you don't know. I think we as adults feel like we need to have an answer for every question, and it can be so powerful for a child to hear the phrase "I don't know" from an adult, because it's this person who is supposed to know everything. Like typically, mom or dad knows everything, and so for them to not have an answer to this, sometimes it actually takes the anxiety out of that scenario, knowing that this person who's really smart is supposed to know everything actually doesn't know the answer. And so I lean heavily when kids are asking questions. If I don't know the answer, I say I don't know. And so it's just, rather than feeling like we need to have an answer for everything, it's absolutely okay for us to say that you don't know. As much as possible, if you can make time for grief, that would be great. It's hard, I think, right now. A lot of people are still, we are starting to see things are opening up, but I think a lot of people are very much dealing with the crisis of either being home from, like either being laid off or not having work or having to work from home while potentially providing childcare and homeschooling their kids and all of these other things. And so I think it can be really easy to focus just on the immediate crisis at hand. But if you have grieving children at home, whether there's a loved one who is dying or died, to try to make some time either to remember that person, maybe to write a letter to them, to look at pictures of them, just to really make time for grief, because I think it's very easy to get kind of preoccupied with the immediate situation at hand. Name and claim. We talk about like name it to claim it, the losses that have occurred. There's so much grief in this pandemic. We have lost so much, and so sometimes just verbalizing and putting words to all of those losses can be helpful. So thinking about, losing being able to see your friends at school, and maybe not being able to visit your family in the same way, and maybe your sports and your extracurricular activities we've lost, and so sometimes just being able to name those losses can help. Practice self-compassion. So I know a lot of parents right now who are literally doing it all, right? They are working, they are homeschooling, they are providing childcare, they are doing doing it all. And so if you are struggling with that, it's absolutely, I think, would be expected. And so and then on top of that, having a loved one who's ill or dying or has died, there's just so much there. And so if you're not functioning at 100%, like, we would not expect that of you, and it would absolutely make sense. And so just being compassionate with yourself and kind of treating yourself the way that you would treat a close friend who is experiencing the same situation that you are, because it's a stressful time. It's a lot right now. We want to model, or for adults, I should say, it's important that we model the behaviors that we want to see with kids. And so that means modeling coping strategies, modeling being able to self-regulate, that kind of thing. Obviously staying connected with loved ones as much as possible, maybe being creative in the ways that you stay connected. And then reassure children if there has been a death, or if someone has gotten COVID-19 or either has caught it or has died from it, reassuring children that they did not cause the death or COVID-19, right? Really, if someone has caught the virus, we won't know who they got it from, and it's very unlikely that our kids would have given it to them. But so again, we want to be honest, but it's again going back to those 5 C's, that did I cause the death, right? And just making sure that kids know that it's not their fault. So we have a couple of pages of resources. So this first slide is more grief related resources, and then these are more COVID-19 related resources. So we will be sending out the slides next week, so I'll kind of invite you to take a look at those on your own. Also important to note that we have just launched at St. Joseph's Hospice our virtual services. We launched them last week. And so this is just a copy of the flyer that we sent out to community partners, Facebook, all that kind of thing. And so we will be including that in the materials that we send out next week. But just know that we have a variety of virtual services available right now. So if you're interested in receiving any of those, please let us know. And we can, or if you're interested in learning more about what virtual services are available, let us know, and we will give you more information on that. I'm going to pass that back to Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Orly. I just want to remind you that if you do have any questions, to just add them to the chat box. I do see that we are right at 2 o'clock right now, but maybe we'll have time to answer a few if we get some. And just to announce that coming up, we have our Caregiving in COVID-19 webinar on July 9th at 1 p.m. And we may be also offering our Honoring Grief in the Workplace webinar again for the second time.
Oh, there we go.
So if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat now.
And if you have some, oh, sorry, I was just going to say,
any questions right now, but
Yes, you're right. And yeah, if you have to run, then that's totally fine. And if you want to email or call us if you have any questions, you can absolutely do that as well.
Mhm. Okay. I don't see any questions, Orly, so
So then maybe what we'll do is we'll just hang around for a couple more minutes. But if you have to get going, then no worries. And we will see you soon with our next webinar in the series that Lisa is going to be debuting. And yeah, so we will stick around for a few more minutes, but if you have to go, then we will see you again. So thank you so much to everyone for attending today, and we hope that this information was helpful to you. And yeah, we'll see you soon.
see you soon and enjoy the rest of your day.